I was staying in the capital city of Greyhold, in a modest inn near the river, when I first heard whispers about Kael. People didn't speak his full name, never his full name, just the Silent One, or the Shadow, or sometimes just a gesture, 2 fingers drawn across the throat. He was a legend, you see. The kind of legend that makes men check their locks twice and taste their wine before drinking. For 30 years, Kael had been the most feared assassin in 6 kingdoms. If someone powerful wanted someone else powerful dead, and had enough gold, they found a way to contact Kael, and then, inevitably, the target would die, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always certainly. What made Kael different from other killers wasn't just his skill, though he was supremely skilled. It was his code. He had rules, you see, and he never broke them. He only accepted contracts on those who held power, nobles, merchants, generals, priests, never common folk. He researched every target thoroughly. If he found them innocent of real wrongdoing, he refused the contract and returned the gold. He never killed children, never killed in ways that harmed bystanders, and never failed to complete a contract once accepted. This code had made him expensive, exclusive, and in his own strange way, almost respectable. There were lords who admitted, privately, very privately, that Kael had probably done more for justice than the king's courts ever had. But Kael was getting old, 56 years, which in his profession might as well be ancient. His hands were still steady, his mind still sharp, but he felt time pressing on him like a weight. He'd been killing for 30 years, and he was tired, not of the work itself, but of what the work had made him. So he decided to take one final contract, one last job, one last fortune, and then he would disappear to some quiet place where no one knew his name or his history. Somewhere he could spend his remaining years as just a man, not a legend made of knives and silence. The contract came through his usual channels, a sealed letter delivered by an intermediary who knew nothing except where to leave it. Inside was a simple message. Target: King Theodric the Third of Aldemir. Crime: tyranny, mass murder, corruption. Payment: 10,000 gold crowns. Deadline: before the winter. Attached was a list, a long, detailed list, of Theodric's crimes. Villages burned for late taxes, families executed for suspected treason, political opponents who vanished, children orphaned by his policies. The list went on for pages, each entry documented with dates and names. Kael read it all. He always did. This was part of his code. Know what you're killing for. Know why it matters. Know that the world will genuinely be better for this death. And in Theodric's case, there was no question. The man was a monster who'd worn a crown for so long he'd forgotten it was just metal and jewels, not a license to devour his own people. Kael accepted the contract. I learned all of this later, of course, pieced together from conversations and observations. At the time, I only knew that something significant was happening in the castle. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the city was holding its breath. I was at the castle myself, actually, on unrelated business. A minor nobleman had hired me to investigate some magical sabotage of his grain stores. Tedious work, but it paid for my travels. This gave me access to the castle grounds, and more importantly, it meant I was there the night Kael arrived. It was 3 hours past midnight when I felt it, a disturbance in the castle's wards, so subtle most wouldn't notice. But I'd been working with magic long enough to sense when someone skilled was moving through protections like a fish through water. Someone was in the castle who shouldn't be. Someone very, very good. Curious, and perhaps foolish, I followed the disturbance. It led me through corridors I'd never walked, past sleeping guards who would swear the next day that no one had passed them, up stairs that wound into the oldest part of the castle. I found myself outside the king's personal chambers. The guards here were more alert, standing at attention despite the hour, but even they hadn't noticed the shadow that had already slipped past them. A shadow that was currently picking the lock on the king's door with hands so steady they might have been carved from stone. should have raised an alarm, should have woken the guards, stopped whatever was about to happen. But I didn't. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the long list of Theodric's crimes that everyone knew but no one spoke of openly. Perhaps it was simply that I wanted to see what happened when legends became real. The lock clicked, the door opened silently. The shadow slipped inside. I waited exactly 30 seconds, then followed, using a small working to cloud the guards' perception. They wouldn't remember I'd passed, just as they wouldn't remember the shadow. Inside, the king's chambers were surprisingly modest. I'd expected opulence, excess, the trappings of a tyrant. Instead, I found a simple room, a large bed, a desk covered in papers, shelves of books, a fireplace burning low, and in the corner, perfectly still, stood Kael. I saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall but not imposing, lean in the way of men who move more than they rest. He wore dark clothes that seemed to drink the firelight, and his face was weathered, lined with years, but his eyes were sharp and cold as winter stars. His right hand rested on the hilt of a knife at his belt, not gripping it, just touching it, the way a man might touch something familiar and comforting. He was staring at the bed where the king slept. Except the king wasn't sleeping. King Theodric sat propped against his pillows, fully awake, looking directly at Kael with an expression of weary recognition. "I was wondering when you'd come," the king said quietly. His voice was rough, strained. "I'm surprised it took this long." Kael said nothing. He never did, hence the name. But his hand tightened slightly on his knife. "You're Kael," Theodric continued, "the Silent One. I've heard about you for years. Always wondered if you were real, or just a story people told to frighten men like me." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "I suppose I have my answer." It was only then that I truly looked at the king and realized what I should have seen immediately. Theodric was dying. Not from poison or injury, but from simple, inexorable illness. His skin had the grey pallor of someone whose body was failing from the inside. His breathing was labored. His hands, resting on the blankets, trembled slightly with weakness. This wasn't a tyrant in his prime. This was an old man at the end of his road. Kael must have seen it too. His hand moved away from his knife, hovering in the air as if uncertain where to go. "Lung fever," Theodric said, answering the unasked question. "The physicians say I have perhaps a month, maybe 2. Ironic, isn't it? I spent 40 years afraid of assassination, and in the end it's just my own failing flesh that kills me." Another cough. "Though I suppose you'll make it quicker." Kael still didn't speak, but I saw something flicker across his face. Confusion, perhaps, or calculation. This wasn't how contracts usually went. "You're here because of what I've done," Theodric said. "The people I've hurt. The suffering I've caused. I know all of it." He looked at his hands. "I remember every order I gave, every execution I approved, every village I burned. I tell myself I had reasons, that I was keeping the kingdom stable, preventing worse violence, making hard choices that weak men couldn't make. But at night, when I can't sleep..." He trailed off. "At night, I know what I am. What I became." The room was utterly silent, except for the crackling fire and the king's labored breathing. "For the past year," Theodric continued, "since I learned I was dying, I've been trying to, I don't know, make amends. That's too grand a word. You can't amend 40 years of cruelty. But I've been trying to do something." He gestured weakly at the desk. "I've been writing pardons, releasing political prisoners, returning seized lands to families, reducing taxes. My advisors think I've gone soft in my final days, that the illness has made me weak and sentimental." He met Kael's eyes. "Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just fear of what comes after death. Maybe I'm trying to buy my way into a better judgment." I don't know my own heart anymore. I've lied to myself too long to trust what I feel. But I'm trying, for whatever that's worth. Kael stood perfectly still, and I could see the conflict playing across his usually impassive face. He'd come here to kill a tyrant, but the man in front of him was already dying and was actively trying to undo his worst acts. What do you do with that? What does your code say when the target is already halfway to dead and trying to die better than he lived? You should still kill me, Theodric said quietly. It would be justice. It would be what I deserve, and it would be kinder than this. This drowning from the inside, this slow suffocation. I wake up choking every night. It's not a good death. He smiled faintly, though I suppose I don't deserve a good death. Kael's hand drifted back to his knife, not drawing it, just touching it again, like a talisman or a prayer. I realized I was holding my breath, and then, for the first time in 30 years of absolute silence, Kael spoke. His voice was rough, unpracticed, like a door opening after decades of being sealed shut. Why? He asked. Just that one word. Theodric understood. Why did I become this? Or why am I trying to change now? Kael nodded slightly. The king was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire. I became king at 22, he said finally. Young, idealistic, certain I would be different from my father, who was a weak man who let the kingdom tear itself apart with petty conflicts. I was going to be strong. I was going to bring order. He laughed bitterly, and I did. I brought such order that people were afraid to breathe wrong. He shifted in his bed, wincing. It happened slowly. The first execution I ordered, a lord who'd betrayed the crown during a rebellion. That was just. That was necessary. But then the next one was easier, and the next, and soon I was signing death warrants without even reading them carefully, trusting my advisors, believing that anyone accused of treason must be guilty because otherwise why would they be accused? Power doesn't corrupt all at once, he continued. It's like walking into a fog. Each step seems fine, seems reasonable, and you don't realize how far you've gone until you're so deep you can't see where you started anymore. And by then, you've built your whole life in the fog. You've surrounded yourself with people who only know the fog. Turning back seems impossible. Another cough. As for why I'm changing now, honestly, I don't know. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's genuine remorse. Maybe it's just that when you're dying, all the things you told yourself don't work anymore. The justifications don't justify. The reasons don't reason. You're just left with what you did and who you hurt. He looked at Kael. But I am trying. The pardons are real. The policy changes are real. I can't undo 40 years in a few months, but I can try to make the final chapter different from the rest of the book. Kael stood there, and I watched him wrestle with something I don't think he'd ever faced before. His code said, complete the contract. Justice demanded it. The families of Theodric's victims deserved it. And yet... Who hired you? Theodric asked suddenly. Kael shook his head. He never revealed clients. Never. I'll guess then, Theodric said. Duke Ferren. He's been angling for the throne. Lord Marshal Crane. He hated me since I refused to make his son a general. He paused. Or maybe it was the Merchants' Council. I've stepped on a lot of powerful toes with these new reforms. Something flickered across Kael's face. Subtle, but there. Ah, Theodric said quietly. The merchants. Of course. I've been cutting into their profits, releasing the debt slaves they rely on, stopping the monopolies they'd built. They want me dead before I can do more damage to their interests. He closed his eyes. And they hired you to do it. Gave you that list of my crimes, all real, all documented, all true, and sent you to enact justice. Except it's not really about justice for them, is it? They just want to stop the reforms. They want things to go back to how they were. Kael's jaw tightened. He hadn't considered this, hadn't thought to ask who benefited from this death beyond the simple calculus of justice. He'd seen the list of crimes and assumed the motive was pure. But motives are never pure. I could have told him that. I've lived long enough to know that even justice can be a mask for greed. "You should still kill me," Theodric said again. "My motives for changing don't erase what I did. I'm still the man who ordered those executions, who burned those villages. Dying while trying to be better doesn't make me good. It just makes me slightly less terrible at the very end." Kael looked at the king, then at the desk covered in pardons and reforms, then back at the king. The knife remained in its sheath, and then he did something I've never forgotten. He walked to the chair beside the king's bed and sat down. Not to kill, just to sit. Theodric stared at him in confusion. "What are you doing?" Kael didn't answer, still keeping his silence, but his meaning was clear. He was staying. "You're going to wait?" Theodric asked. "Wait for me to die naturally?" Kael nodded once. "That could take weeks, maybe a month." Another nod. "Why?" This time Kael didn't respond. Maybe he didn't have an answer. Maybe he was still figuring it out himself. Or maybe he understood something that took me longer to see. That sometimes the hardest thing to do isn't killing. It's waiting. It's witnessing. It's sitting with someone while they try to become better, even if they fail, even if they don't have enough time, even if the effort is too little and too late. I left them there, the dying king and the assassin who couldn't kill him, and went back to my own rooms. But I couldn't sleep. The weight of what I'd witnessed pressed on me like a physical thing. Over the following days, I found excuses to stay in the castle. The grain investigation conveniently became more complex, requiring additional research and observation. No one questioned a wizard's need for thoroughness, and every night I checked on the king's chambers. Kael was always there. He never left. He sat in that chair beside the bed day and night, watching the king slowly fail. Sometimes Theodric slept, sometimes they spoke. Or rather, Theodric spoke, and Kael listened, occasionally nodding or shaking his head. The king told him stories about his childhood, about the father who'd disappointed him, about the weight of the crown and how it bent his spine, about his wife, who'd died 20 years ago and who he still missed, about the son who'd died in infancy and the children he'd never had after that. He told Kael about specific decisions, the moments when he'd chosen cruelty over mercy, power over compassion. He didn't make excuses, didn't ask for forgiveness. He just remembered them aloud, bearing witness to his own sins with someone who would understand their weight. And Kael listened, just listened. Sometimes servants came in, physicians to check on the king, attendants to bring food and change linens. They saw Kael sitting there but didn't comment. Perhaps they thought he was a distant relative or a priest. Perhaps they simply didn't want to know. The king's reforms continued. Each day he'd work for a few hours when he had strength, signing documents, writing letters, making decisions that slowly began to undo years of cruelty. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. Kael watched it all, witnessed it all. One night, about 2 weeks into this strange vigil, I found Kael standing alone on the king's balcony, looking out over the city. I approached carefully. Assassins tend to be jumpy, but he showed no surprise at my presence. He'd known I was there from the beginning, I realized. Had let me watch because I'm not sure why. Perhaps he needed a witness too. "You could still complete the contract," I said quietly. "No one would know the difference. A dying man dies a few weeks early. Who could prove it wasn't natural?" Kael looked at me for the first time, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't expected. Pain. Not physical pain, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from holding contradictions inside your chest until they cut you from within. He turned back to the city, still didn't speak. "You're not killing him," I said, "because killing him now would be murder, not justice. Justice would have been killing him 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when he was still actively causing harm. Now," I trailed off. "Now he's just a dying man trying to be better, and killing someone for what they were rather than what they are. That's not justice. That's revenge." Kael's hands gripped the balcony railing, knuckles white. "But if you don't complete the contract," I continued, "you break your code. And your code is all you have. It's what separates you from common murderers. Without it, the past 30 years of killing become just killing. Without meaning, without purpose." He turned to look at me again, and I saw the question in his eyes. "So what do I do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm just a wizard. I understand magic, not morality. But I think..." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I think maybe the right thing to do is the thing that costs you the most. And for you, that's not killing him. That's staying with him. That's bearing witness to his attempts at redemption, even knowing they can't redeem him. That's sitting with the contradiction and not resolving it." Kael stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, once, and then he went back inside to his vigil. 3 weeks after Kael had first entered the king's chambers, Theodric's condition worsened dramatically. The physicians said it would be days now, maybe hours. The king's advisors and nobles began gathering, preparing for the transition of power. There were already whispers about who would succeed him. He had no direct heirs, so it would fall to the council to choose from among the high nobles. Duke Ferran, predictably, was positioning himself as the leading candidate. And I noticed something. As soon as it became clear Theodric was truly dying, the reforms stopped. The pardons Theodric had signed, but not yet implemented, were delayed for review. The prisoners he'd ordered released remained in their cells, pending verification. The tax reductions were subject to council approval. Everything the dying king had tried to do in his final months was being quietly undone before he was even dead. I saw Kael realize this too. He was standing in the hallway outside the king's chambers when Duke Ferran swept past with his entourage, and I watched Kael's face as he overheard the duke's conversation. "Let the old fool die thinking he made a difference. We'll reverse it all within a week of his death. The merchants are growing impatient." Kael's hand went to his knife, not to draw it, but to hold it, to remind himself it was there. That night the king woke from a troubled sleep to find Kael sitting beside him as always. "You're still here," Theodric whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why? Why have you stayed?" Kael was quiet for a long moment, and then, for the second time in 30 years, he spoke. "Because you tried," he said simply. Theodric closed his eyes. "It didn't matter. They're going to undo it all. I can hear them outside making their plans. Everything I did, everything I tried to fix. It was pointless." "No," Kael said, and then more firmly, "no." He leaned forward, and for the first time, there was intensity in his usually impassive face. "Trying matters. Even if it fails. Even if it's too late. Even if no one sees it or remembers it. You tried. You could have died as you lived. Cruel, certain, proud. But you didn't. In your final days, you chose differently. That matters." "To who?" Theodric asked. "To what? The world doesn't care. It will remember me as a tyrant, and nothing I did in these few months will change that. History won't record this." "I'll remember," Kael said quietly. "And I have a very long memory." Theodric opened his eyes and looked at the assassin who had come to kill him, and instead had witnessed his attempt at redemption. "Will you complete your contract?" he asked. Kael shook his head. "No, you're already dying, and you're not the man I was hired to kill anymore. Then you'll lose your reputation. They'll say you failed. Let them. You'll have to return the gold." "I'll return it. They'll send someone else. Someone without a code. Someone who'll kill me quickly and messily and undo even the attempt I made." Kael's jaw tightened. "Then I'll stop them." And he did. Over the next 3 days, as Theodric faded, Kael became not his assassin, but his guardian. 2 other attempts were made on the king's life, one by poison, one by a blade in the dark. Kael stopped both. The kingdom's powerful men had hired him to kill the king, and now he was keeping the king alive long enough to die on his own terms. The irony was not lost on anyone. On the 4th day, just before dawn, Theodric took his last breath. He died quietly in his sleep, with Kael sitting in the chair beside him. The assassin sat there for a long time after, just looking at the still face of the man he'd been hired to kill. Then he stood, straightened the blankets around the body with surprising gentleness, and walked out of the room. I was waiting in the hallway. He looked at me and nodded once. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or goodbye. "What will you do now?" I asked. He considered the question. "Return the gold," he said in that rough, unpracticed voice. "Tell them the contract is void. The man they wanted dead no longer exists. They won't accept that." "No," he agreed. "They'll want blood. They'll try to force me to complete it." And a slight smile, the first I'd seen from him. "Then I'll remind them why people call me the Silent One. Not because I don't speak, but because those who hear me coming rarely live to tell about it." He started walking toward the exit, then paused and turned back. "The wizard who wrote those pardons," he said. "The one who helped the king with the reforms. Make sure his work isn't lost. Make sure someone remembers what the king tried to do. It matters, even if it failed." "Especially because it failed," Kael said. "Success writes its own story. Failure needs witnesses." And then he was gone, moving through the castle like a shadow, past guards who never quite saw him, out into the dawn of a city that would wake to find their king dead and never know how many people had tried to kill him in his final days, or that one of them had chosen instead to let him die naturally. I did what he asked. I found the documents Theodric had been working on, the pardons, the reforms, the letters of apology to families he'd wronged. Most had been delayed by the council, but I made copies of everything. Not for immediate use. The political situation was too delicate for that, but for history, for the record. Because Kael was right. Trying matters, even when it fails. Especially when it fails. The merchants never got their blood. The contract was never completed. And Duke Ferran, who'd been so certain he'd ascend to the throne, found himself facing unexpected opposition from other nobles who'd somehow learned about his involvement in trying to have Theodric murdered in his final days. The information came from nowhere, untraceable, but it was enough to poison his ambitions. I suspect I know who released it. As for Kael, I never saw him again. The legend of the Silent One faded after that. No more contracts, no more deaths in the night. Some said he'd died. Others said he'd finally retired. I like to think he found that quiet place he'd been looking for. A village where no one knew his name or his history. A life that was just a life, not a legend made of knives and silence. But I also like to think that sometimes, when he's sitting by his fire on cold nights, he remembers those weeks in the king's chambers. Remembers the dying tyrant who tried to be better. Remembers making the choice to witness rather than execute, to stay rather than kill, to break his perfect record in service of something more important than his code. The fire is burning low now, The night is deep and quiet. I've thought about that story often over the years, about what it means to try to be better, even when it's too late, about whether redemption is possible, or if some things we do are simply beyond amending, about the difference between justice and mercy, and whether there are times when mercy is the harder, braver choice. I don't have answers. I'm just a wizard. I understand magic, not morality. But I know this. Kael taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't taking a life. It's sitting with someone while they try to figure out how to die as someone different than who they lived as. It's witnessing the attempt, even when the attempt fails. It's remembering that they tried, even when the world forgets. Theodric was a tyrant. He did terrible things. He hurt countless people, and nothing he did in his final months erased that or balanced those scales. You can't redeem 40 years of cruelty with a few weeks of reform. But he tried, and Kael honored that trying by refusing to kill him for who he'd been, choosing instead to witness who he was trying to become. That's not justice. It's not mercy either, exactly. It's something harder to name. Something like compassion, maybe. The kind that doesn't excuse or forgive, but simply sees and acknowledges the attempt at transformation, even a failed attempt, even one that comes too late. The world needs justice, yes. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it needs this too. It needs people willing to sit in the hard places, in the contradictions, in the spaces where the right answer isn't clear and the moral path forks into equally thorny directions. It needs people brave enough to witness rather than judge, to stay rather than strike, to break their own codes when the code demands something that doesn't serve what's actually right. Kael was an assassin who refused to kill, a legend who broke his perfect record, a man of absolute codes who chose the messy, uncertain path of compassion over the clean certainty of execution. And I think that makes him the best man I ever met, though he would never call himself good. Sleep well, friend. And if you dream tonight of choices and codes and contradictions, remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose the path that costs us the most, the one that breaks our rules, the one that makes us sit with discomfort and uncertainty and the knowledge that we might be wrong. Sometimes the hardest kill is the one you don't make. Sweet dreams.